All ye that in the condemned hold doth lie, prepare ye, for tomorrow you shall die. Watch and pray, the hour is drawing near, that you before the Almighty must appear. Examine well yourselves, in time repent, that you may not to eternal flames be sent. And when Saint Sepulchre's bell in the morning tolls, the Lord above have mercy on your souls. This was called the Bellman's Chorus, and it was performed in around the 1500s in London itself at the Church of St. Sepulchre, which was adjoining a prison. It was said on the night before an execution. I'd like to introduce you guys to the executioner, who is underrepresented in role-playing games and in fantasy games in general, unless you have a player who's been captured and is about taken away. But I think he has a better role that can be played in the medieval town and medieval life, and the way I use him, and I use a lot of characters I'd like to illustrate in the future, is to give flavor to a new town that your players have arrived at, or a new location, to help the town feel more alive. If you ever found yourself with a full plot prepared and knowing exactly where your players are going to go, but not knowing how to get your players to go there without just laying down railroad tracks and putting them aboard the train, then the executioner might help give a little more flavor, something for your players to engage with. So as I start to describe the executioner, his role kind of in medieval era, some of the tools he used, and some of the interesting little tidbits you might be able to include in your game, I want you to sit back and imagine it as though you're a player. Take some time to think what they might look like, the presence in the story, and try to make him come alive. And if you find as I'm describing him that he kind of comes alive to you in that way that I described, that this probably tells you this is the kind of content you're looking for. You should subscribe and go ahead and take some notes, because we're going to get started right now. So before we start, I'd like to tell you about this book. It's called The Lord High Executioner by Howard Ingle, and it's a source I'm using for a lot of this information. This book goes over the prehistory of executioners all the way till the modern day. The first recorded executioner we really have in history goes all the way back to the Odyssey, where Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, was instructed to execute his mother's maids after they were disloyal. And from then all the way until the present day, we've had people who have been instructed to perform society's worst deeds. The people who are chosen to be headsmen or hangmen, as they're often called, aren't the highest class people. They aren't noblemen. Quite often they themselves are criminals. They have been told that, well, hey, this is your job unless you want to spend the rest of your life in prison. Or sometimes they're butchers. People who, well, you already have a knack for chopping up meat, let's have you do a bit of this. It was a very low-class job. And the presence of the executioner in town, nobody really liked them. They were always part of the outcasts. In some places they made up for that. In France, for example, in the late medieval period, they had a law called the havage, and I'm not sure what the pronunciation is, but it roughly translates to the right to take. So an executioner, they could walk into a market stall, whatever they could take with one hand, they could have. They could take any piece of fruit or a fish or a handful of grain, and that allowed them to supplement their own income. Quite often the executioners were also employed on the side in digging graves or doing other menial tasks that nobody likes to do. The hangman and the headsman are the two big categories we're talking about. So the hangman, of course, would hang people by the neck until they died, versus the headsman chopped off the heads. So talk about the hangman for a moment. There's an interesting development in technology and technique over time, which meant that the early hangmen, oftentimes, and you get this even in biblical times, when somebody would be tied by the neck up to a tree branch, and they'd be set on the back of a horse, and the horse would ride away, and the person would hang until they strangled to death. And this was considered the short drop technique. But hangmen, even though they were, again, the dregs of society, they learned over the ages, and they developed what they called the long drop. And in fact, there are actual historical records of what they call the long drop tables, which tells you how far somebody has to drop to snap their neck. But this only, of course, deepened the mystery about the executioner, that they would actually trade and swap intel from one executioner to another on the proper techniques to be able to execute them. Then you have the headsman. And there are two primary weapons used by a headsman in order to take off somebody's head. Is the axe, which we've seen, and it's always a very, very large blade that they could drop from a great height in order to kill somebody, or the executioner's sword. There's something unique about the executioner's sword. When you see pictures of, and I'll have some up here, the executioner's sword isn't sharp. In fact, most swords are tapered at the tip. They get smaller and lighter to keep the balance of weight near the grip so they swing well. The executioner's sword didn't do that. There's two reasons. One, it made it really good for dropping. A lot of weight behind it allows it to cut through a neck cleanly. But second, because again, they were not the noblemen. They, in England and other places, were not knights, which means they weren't allowed to carry swords, which meant they had to have a weapon which couldn't really effectively be used in war. So they were intentionally made, so they were heavy, so they couldn't be used in war, but they could be used to execute somebody. Furthermore, you even see some have holes drilled near the tip. And historians don't really know exactly the reason for it, but one of the primary assumptions is that they were drilled there near the tip in order to prevent them from being able to sharpen the blade or cut it down without extraordinary effort and losing the vast majority of the blade and making it completely unwieldy again. So, between hangmans and headsmen, you really have quite a variety of individuals who can perform this role in society. So in our games, we can use hangmen in many circumstances. It's always a classic, and we've seen this in some video games, the idea that an execution is happening as you enter town, and you as an observer have to see the way this town is and the way they execute their law by watching an execution. But I like using a little more subtle fashion. Your players have arrived into town. They've settled in, they've gone to the tavern, they've bought some drinks, rented a room for the night, and they're just at that point where they're looking around, okay, where's the quest hook? You know, they're looking, is there a town message board? Is there somebody who's about to come running out of the house screaming in pain? You know, they know how the game's played, right? But the tavern's bustling, the atmosphere is warm, and the tavern door opens and somebody steps in. It's the executioner. The players don't know it because, of course, the executioner isn't fully clad in his leather armor with his hood up or anything. But despite this, the tavern goes quiet. Everybody around, they know who he is, and they've stopped talking. And your players are of course, look at each other and, okay, who's this guy? You know, he's the next quest, right? And the executioner walks up to the bar, and he demands a drink, and the tavern keep gives him one. Under the rights of halvage, he can't charge. And so you see the tavern keep is a little bit grumpy about it, but serves him a drink and walks away, and you emphasize that no gold traded hands. And so now your players are rather curious. They want to know who this is. Is this a baron who's come through? Is it a man who's extorting something from them? And so one of your more audacious players is going to try to approach them. And that's when you intercept them with the quest NPC. That's when the person comes up, oh, no, you don't want to talk to them. Come on over here. And they pull them to the side. And that's when they have a quest to introduce them. And so what you have here is you have in front of players a choice. They can pursue the executioner, or they can pursue this other quest they've been given. And it gives a feeling of reality to your world. The second time I'd like to introduce or way I'd like to introduce an executioner is a little more confrontational. You know, your players have probably seen the execution starting when they walked into town, or have seen people talk about him, and your players want to confront him. Well, the executioner, he knows he's protected by the lords, even though he isn't one himself. He knows that everybody has to pay deference to him, and is used to people not liking him. And so after a bit of a banter back and forth, or your players disliking him or talking to him in some way, the executioner just kind of looks at them and sizes them up for a moment. And if he's talking to a larger creature, like a half-orc or something like that, and he just says in a bit of a passive voice, monsters like you, the best part is they don't have to drop very far to snap your neck, and walks away. Okay? It's a way for the executioner to assert his authority, assert his power, and know that he's protected by the law, even though he may be a lowly person. So I hope you've enjoyed this review of the executioner. I have more videos coming, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.